Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The first morning I noticed it, I put it down to a long week. I'd been doing a grading job on a new residential development on the east side of town. 3 days of machine work followed by 2 days of hand finishing. The kind of job that gets into every crease and joint of your hands no matter how well you clean up afterward. I'd come home Friday evening and showered and gone to bed and woken up Saturday morning with red clay under my fingernails. I showered again. I went about my weekend. On Monday, I was back on a job. I noticed it the second time the following week. I'd had a lighter few days, a couple of drainage consultations, and a small retaining wall project that was mostly planning rather than digging. And I'd gone to bed with clean hands because I make it a point to go to bed with clean hands, partly out of habit and partly because ground-in soil does things to your sheets that are expensive to reverse. I woke up Tuesday morning and the red clay was back, packed under the nails of both hands and worked into the lines of my palms. The same red clay. I recognized it the way I recognized any soil composition I'd worked with, automatically. The color and texture and specific quality of it registering as a familiar thing before I'd consciously decided to analyze it. It was a red-orange elite clay with a particular fine grain, the kind that compacted well but drained poorly, the kind you found in certain geological pockets but not in my neighborhood, where the native soil ran to a sandy loam over a clay-heavy subsoil that was nothing like what I was finding on my hands. I'd worked with every soil type in the county over 20 years of landscape contracting. I hadn't worked with this one locally. I wasn't sure where it was from. I went outside and walked my yard, which I do regularly because a landscape contractor with a neglected yard is a contradiction I've never been comfortable with. The soil in my yard was my soil. The sandy loam I knew, nothing out of place. No recent digging, no disturbance. I went to work and didn't think about it until it happened again. Thursday. My name is Pell and I've been doing landscape grading and earthwork for going on 20 years, which means I've spent most of my adult life reading land the way other people read faces, the grade and drainage and soil composition of a property telling me things about its history and its future that the property's owners often don't know. I do residential and commercial work, mostly site prep and drainage solutions, and the kind of grading that turns a problematic piece of land into a functional one. It's not glamorous work, and it's not particularly clean work, but it's work I understand completely. And I'm good at it. And there's a satisfaction in that which I've never stopped finding adequate. The third time with the clay, I paid closer attention. Not just the hands, my knees, the kind of pressure mark you get from kneeling on hard ground for an extended period. The skin slightly reddened along the kneecaps. My lower back had the specific ache of a day of digging. Not the general fatigue of normal physical work, but the targeted soreness of muscles used in a particular way for an extended time. My right index fingernail had a crack across the top that I'd woken up with and hadn't made during the previous day. The kind of crack that happened when a nail caught under something and flexed too far. I sat on the edge of my bed on a Thursday morning and looked at my hands, and the evidence was the evidence of a person who had spent several hours digging in red clay soil. I had no memory of any of it. I spent a week ruling things out. I set up my phone to record audio overnight, which told me I got up twice to use the bathroom and otherwise didn't leave the bed. I checked the perimeter of my property for disturbed ground every morning, finding nothing. I kept a close eye on my hands before bed, photographing them as a baseline, and compared them to what I woke up with. The clay appeared regardless of what I did. Some mornings more than others, some mornings almost nothing. But it was there consistently enough that I could no longer attribute it to anything I was doing while awake. The audio recordings gave me nothing because I wasn't going anywhere in this world while I slept. It took me another week to figure out that the digging was happening somewhere else. I know how that sounds. I'm a landscape contractor, not a person with a philosophical orientation toward the unexplained. And the sentence I just wrote is not the kind of sentence I would have written about myself 3 months ago. But I've been in this trade long enough to know that the evidence is the evidence, and the evidence was pointing somewhere specific. I started researching the red clay, not academically, just practically, the way I researched any unfamiliar soil composition when I encountered one on a job. I took samples from under my fingernails and matched them against the soil survey data for the county and the surrounding counties and didn't find a match. I expanded the search, looking at regional geological surveys, and came close to a match in a different formation type than anything in my immediate area. A formation type that the surveys indicated would have been the dominant soil profile in my neighborhood if a different set of glacial deposits had occurred about 12,000 years ago. The soil I was waking up with was the soil my neighborhood would have had if the geology had gone differently. I sat with that for a while, and then I thought about what it meant. And then I thought about the fact that I was going somewhere in my sleep that had different geology than where I went to sleep. And I started paying attention to my sleep in a different way. The crossing happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after I'd first found the clay. I know it happened on a Thursday because that's when the calendar said it was when I went to bed. And I know I was aware of crossing because I made myself aware of it, which is a harder thing to explain than I'd like it to be. I'd been practicing a kind of deliberate attention to the moment between sleep and not sleep, the specific threshold, and on Thursday night, I caught it. I was in my yard, and I wasn't in my yard. The same footprint, the same property lines, the same house behind me, but the soil under my hands was the red clay, and the night air had a different quality, slightly warmer, slightly more humid, and the tree line at the back of the property was wrong, denser and taller than my tree line, and the house was different in its details, a different color, different windows, the same structure dressed differently. I was on my hands and knees in a hole about 2 feet deep and 18 inches across, and I had apparently been digging for a while because the pile of displaced clay beside the hole was substantial. I sat back on my heels and looked at my hands and looked at the hole and looked at the yard around me. A woman was standing at the edge of the yard, watching me. She was maybe 60, spare, wearing a canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, and she had the look of someone who had been watching something for a long time and was now watching it change in a way she hadn't fully prepared for. She looked at my face with an expression that moved through several things quickly. Something like relief, then alarm, then a very specific caution. She said, "You woke up." I told her I had. I told her I'd worked to wake up, that I'd been tracking what was happening for 3 weeks, and I'd made a point of catching the transition. I told her I had about 40 questions, and I was going to need her to answer them, starting with who she was and what she'd done to me. She told me her name was Dial. She said it without the defensive hedging of someone who expected to be yelled at, which I respected, even though I was angry enough to yell. She told me she'd lived in this house for 20 years. Not my house, the version of it in her world. Same location, same basic structure, the house she'd bought in her 40s and spent 20 years making into a home. She told me the property had been seized from her 4 years ago in a dispute she described only as complicated and unjust, and that she'd been removed before she'd been able to take everything she needed. I asked her what she'd left behind. She said documents, records of the property's history going back 40 years, records of her ownership, financial records, correspondence, the paper trail of a life lived in one place for a long time. She'd buried them in the yard, in a sealed container before she left, because she couldn't carry them, and she couldn't let them be destroyed, and she hadn't had time to do anything else. I asked her why she couldn't come get them herself. She said the property had changed hands twice since she'd lost it, and the current owners had no reason to let her on the land. She said she'd been looking for a way back to the buried container for years and hadn't found one until she'd felt the thin place between this version of the property and mine, the specific overlap of the same land across 2 worlds, and had found a way to direct my hands during my sleep without my knowing. I looked at her. I looked at the hole I'd apparently been working on under her direction for weeks, the red clay piled beside it, the particular physical toll of it still in my back and my knees. I said, "You used me without asking." She said yes. She said it plainly, without trying to soften it. She said she knew it was wrong, and she'd done it anyway because she didn't see another way, and because she'd told herself the physical cost to me was low. I told her the cost wasn't the main point. She said she knew that too. We looked at each other across the hole for a moment. I thought about what she'd described. 20 years in one place. The specific attachment of a person who had made a home out of a piece of land and spent 2 decades working the soil and knowing the property in the way that long-term residents know land, and then losing it in a dispute and being removed before she could take everything that mattered. I thought about the container in the ground and what it represented, not the financial records specifically, but the fact of them, the evidence of a life lived on a piece of ground that had then been taken away. I'm a landscape contractor. I spend my working life reading land and understanding what it holds and what it gives up when you work it properly. I understood, more than many people might have, what it meant to have something buried in a yard you couldn't access. I told her I was going to finish the dig, consciously, on my own terms, with my eyes open. She didn't say thank you, and I was glad for that, because thank you would have been the wrong tone for the situation. She just stepped back and let me work. The container was about 8 inches further down than where I'd already dug. A rectangular metal box about the size of a shoebox, well sealed. the kind of container designed to protect its contents from moisture and time. I pulled it out of the hole and set it on the pile of displaced clay and looked at it. It was solid and undamaged and had been in the ground long enough that the clay had compacted around it, but it came out clean. Good container, properly buried. The burial had been done by someone who knew what they were doing, the depth right for the climate, the orientation correct for drainage. I handed it to Dial. She held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment, the look of a person seeing something they'd given up on seeing again. I asked her to stop directing my sleep. She said it was already done. She said the crossing had been directional, moving from her side toward mine, and she'd been sustaining it through focused attention over many nights, and without that attention, it would close on its own. She said she was sorry, which she'd already said with her eyes a few minutes ago, and meant it both times. I climbed out of the hole and looked at the displaced clay beside it and at the hole itself. 2 feet deep and 18 inches across, properly sided, no collapse risk. I told her she'd done a decent job directing the digging, even if the arrangement was unacceptable. She said she'd had good material to work with. I didn't say anything to that. Then I was in my own yard, my own soil, the sandy loam I knew, the familiar night air of my own neighborhood, the tree line at the back of the property exactly where it should be. My hands were dirty, and my back ached, and my right index fingernail had a fresh crack across the top that I was going to have to deal with in the morning. I went inside and washed my hands and went back to bed. The clay stopped after that. I checked my hands every morning for 2 weeks, the professional habit of a man who'd been doing it long enough that the checking itself had become automatic, and the hands came up clean. My soil, nothing else. I filled the hole in my yard on the off chance there was any corresponding physical disturbance on my side of the land, though I didn't think there was. There wasn't. My yard was undisturbed, the native soil intact. No evidence of anything. About 6 weeks later, I was doing a preliminary assessment on a property 2 streets over. A homeowner who wanted a retaining wall and needed a soil survey to understand what they were working with. I pulled core samples from 6 locations across the yard, standard practice, and ran them through the basic field tests I did on every job: compaction, composition, drainage characteristics. The samples ran clean. Sandy loam over clay subsoil, the native profile, what I'd expected. I was capping the last sample when I noticed my hands. Clean, completely clean. The specific clean of hands that have only been in familiar soil. Soil I knew the way I knew my own yard, the material I'd spent 20 years reading and working and understanding, just my own land. I put the samples in the truck and drove back to the office and wrote up the assessment and sent it to the homeowner. And the rest of the week was the regular work of a landscape contractor in the middle of a normal season, which was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.